Imagine being just a teenager, standing alone in the dark, gripping a musket that feels far too heavy for your hands. A cold wind rattles the trees, biting through the thin coat of a soldier who is miles from home. He is only 16 years old, and the fate of a new nation rests on his weary shoulders. But before we step into his muddy boots, let's take a moment to pause and find our own warmth. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where history helps us unwind. I'm curious, where are you joining us from tonight? As our global campfire grows brighter with every story we share, I invite you to get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the modern world fade away. Now, let's drift back to 1776, not to the loud halls of Congress, but to the quiet, hidden front lines, to see the birth of a country through the eyes of those who fought for it. The year is 1776, and the world is turning upside down. In the rolling green hills of New England and the red clay fields of Virginia, the rhythm of life had always been dictated by the seasons. You planted when the ground thawed. You harvested when the leaves turned gold. But this year, a different kind of season has taken hold. Historians would later look back on the early months of this year and describe a phenomenon called the rage militaire. It translates to a passion for arms. It was a fever that swept through the colonies, a contagious excitement that made the plow feel heavy and the musket feel light. For a young man of 16, living on a family farm, the war felt less like a terrifying catastrophe and more like a grand adventure that was passing him by. In the evenings, neighbors would gather in the local tavern or the village green. The talk was not of crop yields or livestock, but of liberty. Copies of a pamphlet titled Common Sense were passed from hand to hand until the paper was soft and worn. Written by Thomas Paine, published just that January, it spoke in plain language that even a boy with little schooling could understand. It argued that an island should not rule a continent. These words sparked a fire in the minds of the youth. The Continental Army was forming, and it was a young man's army. While the officers might be older men with gray in their beards, the rank and file were often incredibly young. The average age was roughly 20, but that number is skewed. In reality, thousands of boys were under 16. They stood on their tiptoes to look taller. They deepened their voices when the recruiting sergeant asked their age. They scrawled the number 18 on a piece of paper and placed it in the sole of their shoe so they could honestly say they were over 18. The promise of a bounty helped grease the wheels of decision. It was usually a small sum of cash or a promise of land, just enough to make a poor farm boy dream of a future where he owned his own plot. The terms of enlistment in 1776 were short, often just for 1 year. It seemed like such a brief time, a single year to march south, drive the British into the sea, and return home a hero before the next harvest. But leaving was not simple. The day of departure was a ritual of quiet heartbreak and stoic pride. Picture the interior of a small farmhouse. The air is thick with the smell of hearth smoke and the rhythmic thud of the loom in the corner. A mother moves silently around the room. Her face is set in a tight line, hiding her fear. She is packing a haversack, a simple linen bag that will hold her son's entire life for the next year. She packs salted pork, wrapped carefully to keep the grease from staining the spare shirt. She adds a few precious candles and a small Bible. The father stands by the door. In his hands he holds a fowling piece. This is not a military weapon. It is a hunting gun used for ducks and deer. But the Continental Army in 1776 is a ragtag force. There are no warehouses full of uniforms and standard weapons, yet most soldiers wear what they wore in the fields: brown linen shirts, breeches that end at the knee, and heavy wool stockings. The father hands the gun to his son. It feels heavy. It feels awkward. It is a tool for survival, now repurposed for war. Outside, the village green is buzzing. The dust rises on the country road as neighbors gather to see the company off. Then you hear it, the sound that will haunt your dreams and drive your waking hours for years to come. The drum, a solitary drummer, beats the parley. It is a sharp, distinct rattle that cuts through the murmur of the crowd. It calls the men to formation. Recruiting sergeants, often men with booming voices and colorful ribbons in their hats, organize the line. This is the evolution of the Minuteman tradition. These are no longer farmers defending their own fences. They are becoming soldiers of a continent. As the column begins to move, the young recruit looks back. He sees his mother standing in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. He sees the familiar shape of the barn. He feels a sudden, sharp pang of regret, a desire to run back to the safety of the known. But the drum pulls him forward. With the farm fading into the distance, the young recruit marches toward a destination that was the center of the world, New York City. The march south is a blur of sore feet and sleeping in barns. But nothing can prepare a country boy for the shock of arrival. New York City in 1776 is a metropolis. To a lad who has never seen a town larger than a few hundred souls, the city is overwhelming. It has a population of roughly 25,000 people, the second largest city in the colonies. The first thing that hits you is the smell. It is a physical wall of scent. The salty tang of the harbor mixes with the stench of open sewers, the smoke of thousands of chimneys, and the unwashed bodies of soldiers. It is a far cry from the scent of pine needles and fresh hay. The noise is a constant, low-level hum, carts clattering on cobblestones, merchants shouting their wares, and the endless arguing of men. The army camps are chaotic. Tents are pitched in uneven rows. Men are cooking over open fires, the smoke stinging their eyes. There is a notorious district near St. Paul's Chapel known as the Holy Ground. It is a red light district, a place of vice that shocks the moral sensibilities of the boys from rural New England. General George Washington, the tall and imposing Virginian who commands this motley force, issues strict orders. He forbids gambling. He forbids swearing. He demands discipline. But his orders are often ignored by men who are used to the freedom of the frontier. The days are filled with labor. The soldiers are not just learning to march, they are digging. Under the blazing summer sun, blisters form on hands that were used to holding plows, not shovels. They are building fortifications. Fort Washington and Fort Lee rise on opposite sides of the Hudson River, intended to stop the enemy ships. The food is another shock. The fresh vegetables and dairy of the farm are gone. In their place is salt beef, hard-tacked biscuits that could crack a tooth, and a strange beverage called spruce beer. It is brewed from the tips of spruce branches, molasses, and water. It tastes bitter and piney, but the officers insist it prevents scurvy, so the men drink it down. Health is a constant worry. The primitive medical understanding of the time means that camps are breeding grounds for disease. They call it camp fever, a catch-all term for typhus and dysentery. It spreads through the crowded tents, taking men out of the line before they ever see a red coat. The weapons are a source of anxiety. The recruit holds his father's fowling piece, but he looks with envy at the men who have proper muskets. The standard weapon of the era is the Brown Bess. It is a British-made musket, weighing 10 pounds with a 75 caliber barrel. It kicks like a mule when fired and sends a lead ball about the size of a marble downrange, but it is inaccurate. Its effective range is only about 80 yards. Beyond that, hitting a man is a matter of luck. Then, on June 29th, the reality of their situation sails into view. The British fleet arrives. It starts as a few specks on the horizon, but soon the harbor is a forest of masts. It looks like a pine forest in winter, stripped of needles, bobbing on the gray water. It is the largest expeditionary force of the 18th century. Over 400 ships, 32,000 troops. The sheer scale of it is terrifying. The British have brought more men to New York than the entire population of Philadelphia. The city is gripped by a manic energy. On July 9th, news of the Declaration of Independence reaches the troops. In a burst of patriotic fervor, soldiers and citizens rush to Bowling Green. There stands a gilded lead statue of King George III on horseback. They throw ropes around it. With heaving and shouting, they topple the monarch to the ground. The lead is melted down to make musket balls. It is said that the king's troops will be met with melted majesty fired from American muskets. But the drilling and the digging were merely a prelude. In late August, the British finally made their move across the water. The waiting game ends on August 27, 1776. The Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, begins. The British land on the beaches, row after row of disciplined soldiers. Among them are the Hessians. These are German mercenaries, hired by the British Crown. To the American teenagers, they look like monsters. They are tall men, made taller by their high brass caps. They wear blue coats and wax their mustaches. They are professional killers, feared for their brutality. The American forces are dug in on the heights, expecting a frontal assault. But the British generals are cunning. They discover a gap in the American lines. The Jamaica Pass, a road to the east, is virtually unguarded. In a stealthy night march, the British army swings around the American flank. The morning brings confusion. The sun rises, hot and humid. Suddenly, the Americans hear firing not just from the front, but from behind them. They are surrounded. The battlefield descends into chaos. This is the first time many of these boys have seen combat, and it is nothing like the glory they imagined in the village tavern. The noise is deafening. 2,000 casualties in a single day create a roar that drowns out thought. The air fills with thick, white sulfur smoke. It burns the throat and waters the eyes. It obscures vision, turning the battlefield into a gray fog where death can come from anywhere. The lack of uniforms adds to the tragedy. Some Americans wear blue, some wear hunting shirts. In the smoke, it is hard to tell friend from foe. Friendly fire incidents occur, men shooting at their own comrades in panic. And then there are the bayonets. The British and Hessians are masters of the bayonet charge. Most Americans have no bayonets on their hunting guns. When the enemy closes the distance, the Americans are defenseless against the cold steel. The Hessian charge is accompanied by a terrifying guttural shout. They show no quarter. The young recruit sees friends he grew up with, boys he played tag with in the schoolyard, falling round him. The metallic clash of bayonets and the sickening thud of musket balls hitting trees and earth creates a symphony of horror. Panic takes hold. It is a primal urge to run, to survive. Groups of men break and flee through the woods and the swamps. But amidst the collapse, there are moments of incredible heroism. The Maryland 400, a regiment of well-drilled troops, makes a stand at the old stone house. They charge the British repeatedly, buying time for the rest of the army to escape. General Washington watches from a hill in Brooklyn Heights. He sees the slaughter of his best troops. He is reported to have said, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." The day ends with a stroke of luck. A sudden thunderstorm rolls in during the afternoon. The rain pours down, soaking the powder and making muskets useless. The British halt their advance, confident that they have the Americans trapped, defeated and cornered against the East River. The young army faced annihilation, needing a miracle to survive the night. The situation is dire. The American army is pinned against the water with the British Navy waiting to cut off their retreat. If the wind changes, the British ships will sail up the river and blast them to pieces. Washington makes a desperate decision. He orders an evacuation. It is the night of August 29th. The operation must be carried out in total secrecy. If the British realize what is happening, they will attack and destroy the army. Washington calls upon a special group of men, Glover's regiment. These are tough, weather-beaten mariners from Marblehead, Massachusetts. They are fishermen, whalers, and sailors. They know how to handle boats in rough water. They gather every boat they can find, sloops, rowboats, flat-bottomed ferries. The night is dark, and the water is choppy. The order is given for absolute silence. No talking, no coughing. Even the wheels of the cannons are wrapped in rags to stifle the sound. The oars of the boats are wrapped in cloth to prevent the creaking of wood against wood and the splash of water. The evacuation begins. Regiment by regiment, the tired, beaten soldiers march down to the ferry landing. They climb into the boats, huddled together in the dark. The Marblehead men row with rhythmic precision. Their calloused hands pull the oars through the black water, ferrying thousands of men across the mile-wide river to Manhattan. But the night is short. As dawn approaches, a large portion of the army is still on the Brooklyn side. The sun threatens to reveal them to the British sentries just a few hundred yards away. Panic begins to rise again. Then the miracle happens. A dense, heavy fog settles over the river and the Brooklyn shore. It is a providential fog, as many would later call it. It is so thick that a man cannot see his own hand in front of his face. It blankets the remaining troops, shielding them from British eyes. Under the cover of this white veil, the last of the boats push off. 9,000 troops are evacuated. Not a single life is lost in the crossing. They leave behind their heavy artillery and many supplies, but the men are saved. Washington, in a display of leadership that cements his legend, is the last man to step off the Brooklyn shore. Imagine the feeling of stepping onto the Manhattan docks as the sun finally burns off the mist. The relief is physical. Knees buckle not from fear, but from the release of tension. The eerie silence of the night, broken only by the lapping of water against wooden hulls, is replaced by the bustle of the city. They look back across the river. The British are there, swarming the empty trenches, baffled by the disappearance of their prey. They were alive, but they were now fugitives in their own land, beginning a retreat that would test their souls. The summer of hope had ended in a crushing defeat, but the army itself remained intact. The revolution had survived its baptism by fire, saved by the grit of fishermen and the grace of the fog. We've only just begun to march with these brave young souls. Is there another specific battle, or perhaps a different era of history, where you'd love to see the world through the eyes of a common soldier? Let me know in the comments. I always look to your ideas to guide our next journey. The autumn leaves had fallen, and with them, the optimism of summer had withered and died. If the escape from New York was a miracle, what followed was a slow, grinding tragedy. The war had shifted from a battle for territory to a desperate struggle for survival. We enter now into the darkest months of the Revolution, a time that history remembers as the crucible of defeat. It was a period where the mettle of the young nation was tested, not by the heat of battle, but by the biting cold of a relentless winter retreat. The nightmare began in earnest in November of 1776. The American army had left a garrison behind at Fort Washington, a stronghold on the northern tip of Manhattan. It was supposed to be impregnable, but on November 16th, the British attacked with overwhelming force. From the New Jersey Palisades, General Washington watched through his spyglass, helpless as the fort fell. He saw the Hessian troops swarm the walls. He saw the American flag come down. 2,800 men were captured in a single afternoon. These were the best equipped and best trained soldiers remaining in the army. They were marched off to British prison ships, floating dungeons in the harbor where thousands would perish from starvation and disease. With the fort went the supplies. Tents to shelter the men from the coming winter were lost. Thousands of blankets, tools, and muskets became the property of the king. The army that remained on the New Jersey side of the Hudson was a shell of its former self. They were no longer an army of hope. They were fugitives. Thus began the retreat across the Jerseys. It was a race for life. Lord Cornwallis, the aggressive British commander, led the pursuit. He was like a master huntsman on a fox hunt, confident that the quarry was cornered and tired. He pushed his men hard, sensing that one decisive blow could end the rebellion before Christmas. The British moved with speed and precision, their redcoats bright against the gray landscape, their supply wagons full, their bellies full. In stark contrast, the American army was disintegrating. Every day, men looked at the gray sky and the muddy road, and they made a choice. The short-term enlistments that had seemed so reasonable in the spring were now expiring. Men whose time was up simply walked away. They did not run. They just turned their backs on the war and started the long walk home to their families. The militia, often called levies, deserted in droves. They had come to fight a battle, not to starve in the mud. General Washington watched his force shrink. From a height of 20,000 in the summer, he was down to roughly 3,000 effective men by December, and the term effective was generous. These men were sick, they were exhausted, they were clothed in rags. The retreat was a logistical nightmare. To slow the British advance, Washington ordered the destruction of bridges. At the Raritan River, the Americans burned the bridge just as the British vanguard came into view. The soldiers could hear the British band playing across the water, a taunting reminder of the power they were fleeing. But the destruction of bridges only bought hours, not days. The British engineers were efficient. They rebuilt and continued the pursuit. Then the weather turned. The autumn rains began, cold and relentless. The roads of New Jersey, which were dirt tracks at the best of times, turned into quagmires. It was not just mud. It was a knee-deep, freezing slurry that sucked the boots right off a man's feet. And that is, if he had boots. Many did not. As the shoes wore out, there were no replacements. Soldiers began wrapping their feet in strips of raw hide or old rags. The psychological warfare was as damaging as the physical hardship. The British commanders offered a pardon to anyone who would swear allegiance to the king. It was a tempting offer. Sign a piece of paper and you could go home. You could sleep in a warm bed. You could eat hot food. You could stop being a traitor and become a subject again. As the army retreated through the towns of New Jersey, they saw their fellow countrymen taking these papers. They saw the people they were fighting for turning their backs on the cause. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The sensory experience of this retreat was one of overwhelming misery. Imagine the sound of thousands of feet pulling out of the sucking mud, a squelching rhythm of exhaustion. The air smelled of wet wool, a pungent, damp odor that never left your nostrils. It mixed with the smell of unwashed bodies, men who had not bathed or changed clothes in weeks. The hunger was a constant gnawing pain. The commissary wagons were empty. Men marched for days on a handful of parched corn or a few ounces of salted beef. The eyes of the men told the story. There was a hollow look, a 1,000-yard stare that saw nothing but the road ahead. The camaraderie of the summer, the jokes and the songs, had vanished. In its place was a grim silence. They were a brotherhood of the damned, marching away from the enemy, marching toward a river that might trap them, marching toward a winter that might kill them. As winter deepened, the chase ended at the banks of the Delaware River, where the remnants of the army collapsed. They had crossed into Pennsylvania, putting the broad, dark waters of the river between them and Cornwallis. They seized every boat for miles up and down the river to prevent the British from following. For a moment they were safe, but it was the safety of a prisoner in a cell. They were trapped against the river, with the enemy gathering on the other side, waiting for the water to freeze so they could walk across and finish the job. The morale of the army hit rock bottom. It was mid-December. The men were huddled in makeshift camps, shivering without tents. The coughing was constant, a hacking chorus that echoed through the woods. It was here, in this atmosphere of impending doom, that a spark was struck. Thomas Paine, the man whose words had ignited the revolution in January, was traveling with the army. He was not a soldier by trade, but he marched with them. He saw the suffering. He saw the defeat in their eyes. One night, sitting by a campfire, he pulled a drum near the flames to use as a desk. On the head of that drum, by the flickering light of the fire, he began to write. He wrote not for the politicians in Philadelphia, but for the shivering boys around him. He titled his new pamphlet, The American Crisis. Washington read the draft. He understood immediately that this was the ammunition his men needed. He ordered it to be read to every regiment on December 23rd and 24th. Picture the scene. It is evening. The wind is howling off the river, biting through the threadbare coats of the men. They are gathered in a circle around a fire, seeking warmth. A captain stands near the light, holding a piece of paper. His voice is hoarse, but he reads loud enough to be heard over the wind. These are the times that try men's souls. The opening line cuts through the cold like a knife. Paine went on to describe two types of people, the sunshine patriot and the summer soldier. These were the men who served their country when it was easy, when the sun was shining and victory seemed certain. But when the winter came, when the darkness fell, they shrank from the service of their country. The men listening around the fire looked at each other. They looked at their rags. They looked at their bleeding feet. They realized that they were not summer soldiers. They were still here. They were the winter soldiers. Paine wrote that tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. He spoke of providence, the belief that a higher power would not give up a people to military destruction who had tried so earnestly to avoid the calamities of war. The words had a physical effect. Spines straightened, heads lifted. The coughing seemed to subside for a moment. It gave them a name for their suffering. It gave them a reason to endure. Washington knew that inspiration alone was not enough. He needed action. He knew something that the British did not fully grasp. On December 31st, 1776, the enlistments of almost his entire army would expire. On January 1st, he would have no army. The revolution would essentially cease to exist. He had 1 week. 1 week to change the course of history. 1 week to convince these men to stay. He decided on a desperate gamble. He would attack. He would cross the river back into New Jersey and strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton. It was a suicide mission, but the alternative was a slow death. The password chosen for the operation was stark and simple: victory or death. With spirits kindled by words, they prepared for a physical impossibility: crossing the ice-choked Delaware. The date was set for Christmas night, December 25th, 1776. Most armies in the 18th century did not fight in the winter. They went into winter quarters, resting and refitting until spring. The British and Hessians were comfortable in Trenton, celebrating the holiday, warm and secure in the belief that the Americans were defeated. The operation began at dusk at a place called McConkey's Ferry. The plan was complex. 3 separate columns were to cross the river at different points. But the night had other plans. A nor'easter, a severe winter storm, blew in with terrifying ferocity. The boats gathered at the ferry landing were not standard military craft. They were Durham boats. These were massive, black cargo vessels used to haul iron ore. They were 40 to 60 feet long, with high walls and shallow drafts. They were heavy, ungainly beasts, but they were unsinkable. Into these dark caverns, the men began to load. Henry Knox, the former bookseller from Boston, who was now the artillery commander, stood on the bank. He was a large man with a booming voice that could be heard over the roar of the wind. He became the conductor of this chaotic symphony. He directed the loading of 18 cannons, massive iron guns that had to be wheeled onto the shifting decks of the boats. He directed the horses, terrified beasts that whinnied and stomped, their hooves slipping on the wet wood. The weather deteriorated rapidly. It began as a cold rain. Then, as the temperature dropped, it turned to sleet that stung the face like needles. Finally, it turned to snow, thick and blinding. But the wind was the worst enemy. It churned the river into a frenzy. And then there was the ice. The Delaware River was choked with it. Large cakes of floating ice, some as big as a wagon, drifted down the current. They smashed against the sides of the wooden boats with a crunch and grind that sounded like bones breaking. The men rowing were the same Marblehead mariners who had saved the army in New York. They were pushed to their limits. They had to navigate these heavy, overloaded boats through a moving obstacle course in pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the occasional lantern held by an officer, reflecting dimly on the black, swirling water. The cold was agonizing. Spray from the river froze instantly on coats and hats. Hands gripping the icy oars went numb, then burned with pain, then went numb again. The crossing was supposed to be finished by midnight, but the ice and the storm caused delay after delay. It was 3 o'clock in the morning before the last gun was across. The other two columns, commanded by other generals, failed to cross. The ice was too thick for them. Washington was alone. He stood on the Jersey shore, wrapped in his cloak, watching the boats come out of the mist. He knew the timetable was ruined. He knew the element of surprise might be lost, but he did not turn back. One of the most enduring images of this night comes from the diaries of officers who were there. They wrote of looking down at the snow and seeing bloody footprints, the jagged ice on the ground, combined with the lack of shoes, cut the feet of the soldiers. They literally left a trail of blood in the snow as they formed up on the riverbank. They reached the Jersey shore, but the hardest part remained, the 9-mile march to Trenton before sunrise. The army was divided into two columns, one led by General Greene, the other by General Sullivan. They took parallel roads toward the town. The storm was now a full blizzard. The snow was driving into their faces, stinging their eyes. The men were beyond exhaustion. They had been awake for 24 hours, working in freezing conditions. As they marched, a strange and deadly phenomenon occurred. Men began to fall asleep while walking. The rhythm of the march, the hypnotic white noise of the wind, and the sheer fatigue shut down their minds. Officers had to run up and down the line, shaking men, striking them with the flat of their swords, screaming at them to stay awake. To lie down in the snow was to die. 2 men did freeze to death on that march, slipping away into the white silence. Then a disaster struck that should have ended the mission. Word came down the line that the gunpowder was wet. The muskets, exposed to the driving snow and sleet, were soaked. A musket with wet powder is just a heavy club. It cannot fire. When Washington received the news, his resolve did not waver. He sent back a chilling order. Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton. The men fixed their bayonets. Those who had none prepared to use the stocks of their guns. They were marching into a gunfight with knives and clubs. The tension was unbearable. Every shadow looked like a sentry. Every sound sounded like an alarm. The element of surprise hung by a thread. The Hessian commander, Colonel Rowell, had been warned. British spies had told him an attack was possible, but Rowell was arrogant. He called the Americans country clowns. He spent the evening playing cards and drinking. A local loyalist, a farmer loyal to the king, had come to Rowell's headquarters that very night. He had a note warning that the Americans were coming. Rowell was busy dealing cards. He shoved the note into his pocket without reading it. It was found on his body the next day, unopened. The timing of the attack was off. They arrived at the outskirts of Trenton at 8 o'clock in the morning. It was fully light. The plan to attack in the dark had failed, but the storm was their ally. The snow was so thick that the Hessian sentries could not see more than a few yards. The wind was so loud it masked the sound of thousands of marching feet. The silence of the snowy landscape was absolute. The only sound was the crunch of boots on the crusted snow and the heavy breathing of the men. Then, suddenly, a dog barked from a farmhouse. It sounded like a cannon shot in the quiet. A Hessian sentry shouted a challenge in German. The Americans did not answer with a password. They answered with a rush of adrenaline. The tired, freezing, hungry teenagers who had been chased across an entire state, who had been beaten and humiliated, who had left their bloody footprints on the ice, surged forward. They were wet, they were cold, and they were angry. As the town of Trenton came into view through the swirling snow, The teenage soldiers gripped their wet muskets, ready to change history. It is hard to imagine the sheer resilience required to march through a blizzard with no shoes, driven only by a belief in something greater. I wonder, what is a moment in your own life where you found strength you didn't know you had? It's these shared stories of resilience that connect us across time. The air in Trenton on the morning of December 26, 1776, was not filled with the birdsong of a winter morning, but with thunder. It was the thunder of a nation announcing its survival. The march through the snow, the blood on the ice, the freezing hours of the crossing, all of it culminated in this moment. The attack was a surprise in the truest sense of the word. The Hessian garrison, comfortable in their belief that no army could move in such weather, were caught entirely off guard. The battle itself was not a long, drawn-out affair of attrition. It was sharp, sudden, and overwhelming. It lasted less than an hour. The American columns poured into the town from two directions, their wet muskets dried as best they could, their bayonets fixed. But the true decisive factor was the artillery. Henry Knox, the bookseller turned general, had managed to drag his 18 cannons across the river and down the icy road. Now, he positioned them at the heads of King and Queen Streets, the two main arteries of the town. When the cannons roared, the sound echoed off the small wooden houses, shaking the snow from the roofs. Grape-shot canisters filled with iron balls swept down the narrow streets. The Hessians tried to form their ranks. They were professional soldiers, disciplined and proud. They rushed out of their quarters, some still in partial uniforms, buttoning coats as they ran. They tried to assemble their bands, to beat the drums that would organize the defense. But the chaos was absolute. The American artillery tore through their formations before they could even begin. Colonel Rowell, the Hessian commander, who had ignored the warning note, tried to rally his men. He mounted his horse and rode into the storm of lead, shouting orders. But it was too late. He was struck by 2 musket balls and fell, mortally wounded. With their leader down and the American cannons dominating the streets, the Hessian resistance crumbled. The surrender was a sight that few of the American teenagers ever expected to see. The Hessians, the dreaded giants who had chased them across New York, lowered their colors. 900 men threw down their weapons. The vibrant colors of the Hessian flags, embroidered with lions and eagles, were lowered into the slush and snow. The toll of the battle was a miracle of statistics. In the combat itself, not a single American was killed. A few were wounded, including a young lieutenant named James Monroe, who would one day become president. But the death toll for the Americans was effectively 0. The greater enemy had been the cold. Some men had succumbed to exposure on the march, but in the fire of battle they had been invincible. The victory yielded more than just prisoners. It yielded life. The Americans captured the Hessian stores. They found hogsheads of rum, barrels of salted pork, and most importantly, boots. Thousands of pairs of boots. For men who had wrapped their feet in rags, this was better than gold. They found warm coats and blankets. They feasted that day, not just on food, but on the sheer, intoxicating relief of victory. The psychological impact was profound. The myth of Hessian invincibility was shattered. They were not monsters, they were men, and they had been beaten by farmers and country clowns. The shock on the faces of the captured Hessians was visible. Many were still groggy from sleep, staring in disbelief at the ragged, dirty men who had bested them. General Washington, who had risked everything, rode among his troops. He shook hands. He did not need to make a speech. His presence riding tall near the front lines, was enough. But the war was not over. After a quick maneuver to escape a British counterattack and another daring victory at Princeton a week later, the adrenaline began to fade. The reality of winter returned. The victory was sweet, but the army needed rest. They moved to the high ground of Morristown to build a city of log huts. The location was chosen with care. Morristown, New Jersey, sat within the protective embrace of the Woching Mountains. These ridges provided a natural fortress. From here, Washington could keep an eye on the British in New York. But the enemy could not easily attack him without fighting uphill through difficult terrain. It was a sanctuary. But a sanctuary in the wilderness is cold. The first order of business was not drilling, but building. The army transformed into a massive construction crew. The sound of the camp changed. The boom of cannons was replaced by the rhythmic thud of thousands of axes chopping wood. It was a sound that echoed through the snowy valleys from dawn until dusk. Washington ordered the construction of log huts. These were not haphazard shelters. They were built to specific dimensions, 14 feet by 16 feet. Each hut was designed to house 12 men. The soldiers worked in teams, their breath pluming in the cold air as they felled the ancient oaks and walnuts of the New Jersey forest. The design was simple but effective. They used rough-hewn logs, notched at the corners to lock together. To keep out the biting wind, they chinked the gaps between the logs with clay and mud. When the clay dried and froze, it formed a seal as hard as stone. At one end of the hut, they built a fireplace and chimney made of wood, lined thickly with clay to prevent it from catching fire. The camp was laid out with military precision. The huts were arranged in streets and avenues, creating a log city in the middle of the woods. There was a sense of order returning to their lives. After months of sleeping in rain-soaked ditches or under the open sky, the concept of a roof and 4 walls felt like a palace. A deep sense of community formed within these small spaces. The 12 men in a hut became a family. They were messmates. They cooked their rations together over the fire. They repaired their clothes together. They shared the warmth of their bodies and the warmth of their stories. General Washington established his headquarters in a large home known as the Ford Mansion, but he rode through the camp daily, ensuring his men were housed before he fully settled in. The relationship with the civilians in Morristown was vital. The local farmers and merchants provided food and supplies, often on credit or for the promise of continental dollars. It was a symbiotic relationship. The army protected the town, and the town fed the army. As the huts were completed, a remarkable thing happened. The enlistments, which had been the source of so much anxiety, began to stabilize. Many of the soldiers, buoyed by the victories at Trenton and Princeton, and now comfortable in their warm huts, decided to re-enlist. They signed their names for another year or for the duration of the war. The army did not dissolve. It hardened. Of course, it was not a paradise. There were times in late winter when food ran low, a period often called the starvation time. But compared to the hell of the retreat across New Jersey, Morristown was a haven. The British, stung by their defeats, remained in their winter quarters in New York and New Brunswick. They had no desire to march into the hills to fight Washington again. They left the Americans in peace. Imagine the sensory shift. The biting wind is replaced by the smell of wood smoke, a comforting, domestic scent that hangs over the valley. The smell of damp clay drying by the fire. the feeling of stepping out of a blizzard and into a room that is dry and warm. The coarse texture of a new blanket issued from the captured stores feels like silk against skin that has been numb for months. In the twilight, looking down from the ridge, one could see the smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys, a visual testament to the fact that the army was still here. Safe within their wooden walls, the soldiers finally had time to think, to write, and to reflect on the year that had changed them. Inside one of these huts, as the wind howls outside, a young soldier sits at a rough plank table. He is 18 now. The boy who left the plow in the spring is gone. In his place is a man who has seen the elephant, as they used to say. He has seen death, he has seen flight, and he has seen victory. He pulls a small, crumpled piece of paper from his haversack. Paper is a precious commodity in the camp. He has to be careful. He smooths it out. He takes a quill pen, perhaps one he cut himself from a goose feather found in a farmyard. He opens a small container of ink powder and mixes it with a few drops of water, stirring it until it turns black. Literacy was surprisingly high in the Continental Army, especially among the New Englanders. These were men who read the Bible and the almanac. Writing home was their only tether to the life they left behind. The mechanics of writing were slow and deliberate. The scratchy sound of the quill on the rough paper is loud in the quiet hut. He writes by the light of a single candle. The golden flame illuminates the page and his own dirty, calloused hand. The ink smells metallic, a scent of iron gall. His hand cramps, not just from the writing, but from the lingering cold that seems to live in his bones. He writes to his mother. He tells her he is alive. He tells her about the food, sometimes good, sometimes just fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked on a rock. He asks for a new shirt, describing how his current one is falling to pieces. He asks about the farm. Did the corn yield well? Is the old horse still working? He does not write about the terror of the bayonet charge or the blood on the snow. He protects her from that. He writes about the cause. In the spring, the cause was a fiery, abstract excitement. Now, in his letter, it is a grim, solemn duty. He mentions General Washington with a reverence usually reserved for biblical figures. He has seen the general ride through the fire, and that image is burned into his mind. Because paper is scarce, he uses a technique called cross-writing. He writes from top to bottom, filling the page. Then, he turns the paper 90 degrees and writes across the lines he just wrote. It creates a grid of words, difficult to read, but necessary to say all that needs to be said. He is careful. He knows the letter might be opened, though censorship is loose. He says nothing of the number of troops or the location of the powder stores. He ends the letter with the formal closing of the time. I remain your humble servant, or your affectionate son. He folds the paper. There is no envelope. He uses a small drop of red sealing wax, melting it in the candle flame to seal the fold. He presses his thumb into the soft wax. He hands it to a friend who is mustered out and walking home. The postal system is the pockets of friends. He sits back. The candle flickers. Outside he hears the distant call of a sentry walking the perimeter. All is well. All is well. And for the first time in months, it actually is. As the letter was sealed with a drop of wax, the camp settled into the deep, restorative rhythm of winter sleep. The nights in Morristown were a time of profound healing. Sleep, for a soldier, is more than just rest. It is a biological imperative, a medicine that knits together the frayed edges of the mind and body. During the retreat, sleep had been a snatched hour in a wet ditch, one eye open, shivering. Now, it was a long, deep dive into oblivion. The hut is crowded, but it is a comfortable crowd. The concept of personal space does not exist. The men sleep in bunks filled with straw. It is a luxury compared to the bare, frozen ground. The straw smells sweet and dry. It rustles softly as men turn in their sleep. They have established a rotation for guard duty. This means that for most nights, a man can sleep through the entire night. 8 hours, 10 hours. It feels like a lifetime. The body begins to repair itself. The blisters on the feet, raw and weeping for weeks, begin to scab over and heal. The frostbite on toes and ears, the black and blue bruises from falls on the ice, slowly fade. Before sleep, there is the time of the story. The fire is banked low, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. The men talk. The older soldiers, veterans of the French and Indian War, tell tales of battles in the deep woods. They talk of home. They argue about politics. But mostly, they talk about the future. They talk about what they will do when the war is over. The soundscape of the winter camp at night is a lullaby. The wind whistles around the corners of the hut, but it cannot get in. The fire pops and crackles, a sound of warmth and safety. You can hear the rhythmic breathing of 12 men, a collective respiration of survival. Some snore, some mutter in their sleep, fighting old battles, but there is no beat to arms. The drums are silent. The drill hours are reduced in the deep winter snow. The days are short. There is more time to rest. They share their rations. A piece of hardtack is toasted on the fire. A bit of cheese is divided 12 ways. They break bread together, a communion of survival. There is a psychological safety that settles over the camp. They know the British are far away in the city. They know the hills protect them. The fear of the midnight attack, the fear of the dawn raid, fades away. The nervous system, stuck in fight or flight mode for half a year, finally begins to downregulate. The young soldier lies in his bunk. He pulls the heavy wool blanket up to his chin. He watches the embers in the fireplace glow a soft, pulsing orange. He feels the heat radiating across the room. He closes his eyes. He feels his muscles unknot. The tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his legs, it all melts away. He drifts. He is not marching. He is not fighting. He is floating. And so, the army of 1776, once a ragged band of teenagers, found their rest, dreaming of the spring to come. The snow continued to fall over the hills of Morristown, blanketing the huts in white. The young soldier, no longer just a farm boy, but a veteran of the Revolution, closed his eyes, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the safety of his brothers. The chaotic roar of battle had faded into the distant past, replaced by the gentle whisper of the winter wind. They had survived. They had held the line. And now, in the heart of winter, there was only peace and the promise of a quiet night. Sleep well, brave scribes. The narrative of the Revolution, with its sharp bugle calls and the thunder of artillery, often obscures the quieter, slower rhythms that underpinned the daily existence of the 18th century. When the smoke clears and the history books are closed, we are left with the human reality of the time reality, governed not by the grand strategies of generals, but by the mundane, repetitive, and deeply physical necessities of life. It is here, in the details of medicine, diet, clothing, and memory, that we find a different kind of story. It is a story told in a lower volume, a gentle, scholarly reflection on the texture of the world that these young men inhabited. We step back now from the frozen banks of the Delaware to examine the fabric of their lives, exploring the theories and the objects that defined their survival. We begin with the medical reality of the era, a landscape of belief and practice that seems, from the vantage point of the present, to be almost mystical in its nature. In the year 1776, the understanding of the human body was still deeply rooted in the ancient theories of the classical world. The medical mind did not see the body as a machine of cells and bacteria, but rather as a vessel of fluids, a delicate balance of the four humors. It was believed that health was dictated by the equilibrium of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To be sick was to be out of balance. To be healed was to have that balance restored. This philosophy guided the hands of the regimental surgeons who tended to the young soldiers in the makeshift hospitals of the campaign. These hospitals were rarely purpose-built facilities. Instead, they were barns with high vaulted ceilings, or country churches where the pews had been pushed aside to make room for rows of straw pallets. In these quiet, dim spaces, the air would have hung heavy with the scent of sickness, but also with the aromatic, earthy smells of the remedies employed to combat it. The medicine of the Revolution was an herbal medicine, relying on the pharmacopoeia of the natural world. For the dreaded intermittent fevers, the shivering ague that plagued the camps, the remedy was Jesuit's bark or quinine. This was a precious commodity, imported and expensive, ground into a fine powder and mixed with wine or water. One can visualize the slow, rhythmic crushing of the mortar and pestle, a sound that would become a constant backdrop in the hospital tents. The grinding of the bark, the careful measuring of the powder into small glass vials, the soft clinking of the glass against a wooden table, these were the quiet sounds of care. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration and a leading medical mind of the colonies, wrote extensively on the health of the troops. He was a strong proponent of the theory of miasmeth, the belief that bad air was the root cause of contagion. He urged officers to ensure cleanliness in the camp, to have the men wash their hands and faces daily, and, crucially, to keep the air moving. Windows in the hospital barns were kept open, even in the chill of autumn, to allow the stagnant, miasmatic air to escape and fresh, pure air to enter. It was a simple prescription, born of a misunderstanding of germs, yet it undoubtedly saved lives by improving ventilation and hygiene. The official ration, as decreed by the Continental Congress, was generous on paper: 1 pound of beef, 1 pound of bread or flour, and a portion of peas or beans. But the reality of the march often reduced this to the barest essentials. The most iconic foodstuff of the war was, without a doubt, the fire cake. This was not a cake in the confectionery sense, but a survival ration of the most primitive kind. These kettles were the center of social life in the squad. A mess of 6 men would share a single kettle. They would take turns fetching wood and water, and they would eat together from the common pot. The steam rising from the kettle, carrying the savory, salty aroma of the stew, was a signal for rest. They would dip their spoon's horn or pewter into the broth, eating in a rhythm of quiet companionship. The scarcity of fresh vegetables was a chronic issue, leading to what was known as land scurvy. To combat this, foraging parties were constantly sent out into the surrounding woods and fields. They would return with whatever the land could offer: wild onions, cress from the stream banks, berries, or nuts. In the autumn, they might find pumpkins or squash left in the fields. These meager additions were tossed into the kettle, adding color and vital nutrients to the gray broth. It was a diet of opportunity, shaped by the seasons and the landscape they traversed. Imagine the sensory experience of drinking it. The liquid would be dark and frothy. The taste was a complex interplay of the deep sweetness of the molasses and the sharp, clean bitterness of the spruce. It smelled of the forest, of pine needles and sap. It was a refreshing, grounding drink, connecting the soldier to the land itself. The brewing of spruce beer was a constant activity in the rear of the camp, with large barrels fermenting quietly in the shade of the wagons. The logistics required to feed an army were staggering. Behind the lines of marching men stretched a long, slow tail of supply wagons. These wagons, pulled by oxen or horses, brought flour from the mills of Pennsylvania and salt from the coast. The rumble of their wooden wheels, the creaking of their axles, and the shouting of the teamsters formed a constant, low-frequency hum behind the army. When the wagons were delayed by mud or snow, the army went hungry. The connection between the millstone grinding grain in a distant valley and the soldier eating fire cake by the Delaware was a fragile thread, easily broken by the weather or the enemy. As we move from the sustenance of the body to the protection of it, we turn our attention to the fabric of war. The uniforms and equipment of the 1776 soldier were not the standardized, mass-produced items of modern warfare. They were objects of craft, varying wildly in texture, color, and quality. They were held, worn, and repaired daily, becoming extensions of the men themselves. The most distinctively American garment was the hunting shirt, with the importation of red wool from Britain cut off. The Continental Army turned to domestic linen. The hunting shirt was a loose, tunic-like garment, reaching halfway down the thigh. It was often fringed at the hem and along the sleeves, a design borrowed from the frontier and the Native Americans. The fringe was not merely decorative. The extra threads helped to wick rain away from the main body of the cloth, helping it dry faster. The texture of this linen was coarse and organic. It was often undyed, the color of oatmeal or unbleached canvas, though some men dyed theirs with walnut hulls to achieve a brownish-gray hue, or with berries for a faded blue. Against the skin, it was rougher than cotton, softening only after months of wear and washing. To wear the hunting shirt was to wear the product of American fields and American looms. It was a symbol of independence, woven into the very cloth. For the legs, breeches were the standard, usually made of buckskin or heavy wool. Buckskin was durable, almost indestructible, but when it got wet, it became heavy and cold, clinging to the skin with a clammy persistence. Drying wet leather by a fire was a slow, careful process. If it dried too fast, it would stiffen and crack. One can imagine the soldiers sitting by the fire in the evening, massaging grease or tallow into their leather breeches to keep them pliable. The smell of animal fat and wet leather would be thick in the air. Shoes were the perennial shortage. As the marches lengthened and the roads froze, leather soles wore thin. Many men replaced their shoes with moccasins, stitched from raw hide. These were soft and silent, allowing for stealth, but they offered little protection against the jagged ice and frozen ruts of the road. The sensation of walking in moccasins was one of feeling every contour of the ground, a direct, tactile connection to the earth that was often painful in the depths of winter. The equipment the soldier carried was heavy and cumbersome, a burden of wood, iron, and leather. The cartridge box was a block of wood, bored with holes to hold 24 paper cartridges, wrapped in a heavy leather flap to keep out the rain. It hung on the hip, a solid, grounding weight. When a soldier ran, the box would thump rhythmically against his side. The leather was kept supple with beeswax and oil, and the smell of this maintenance was the smell of the soldier's trade. The haversack, a simple linen bag slung over the shoulder, held the soldier's food and personal effects. To waterproof it, the linen was often painted with a mixture of linseed oil and paint, giving it a stiff, waxy texture. Inside might be a spare shirt, a hunk of cheese, a letter from home, and perhaps a small sewing kit. Soldiers were constantly repairing their own clothes. The sight of a young man sitting under a tree, squinting as he threaded a needle to patch a tear in his breeches, was as common as the sight of drilling. The sound of the needle piercing the thick fabric, the pulling of the thread, these were the quiet domestic moments of camp life. Then there was the musket. It was a tool that required constant devotion. The barrel had to be kept free of rust, polished with brick dust and oil until it gleamed in the firelight. The lock mechanism, the flint, the steel, the pan had to be wiped clean of powder residue. A dirty musket was a dead musket. Soldiers would spend hours in the evening casting their own musket balls. They would melt lead in a ladle over the fire, the metal turning to a silvery liquid. Then they would pour it into a small iron mold. The hiss of the hot lead, the clink of the cooling ball as it was dropped onto a cloth, this was the industrial rhythm of the individual soldier. These objects, the hunting shirt, the heavy cartridge box, the polished musket were not just tools, they were the physical shell of the soldier. They protected him, burdened him, and defined his silhouette against the winter sky. And while his hands were busy polishing brass or stitching linen, his mind was often far away, drifting back to the world he had left behind. The home front was not a separate entity from the war. It was the anchor that held the soldiers in place. The connection between the camp and the home was maintained through the fragile, slow-moving stream of letters. In an era without telegraphs or trains, news traveled at the speed of a horse. A letter written in a farmhouse in Connecticut might take weeks to reach a camp in Pennsylvania. It would pass through many hands, carried in saddlebags, transferred to wagons, and finally sorted by a harried officer by candlelight. For the families left behind, the war was a time of waiting and taking on new burdens. With the men gone, the women of the household assumed the role of deputy husband. This was a legal and social concept of the time, empowering women to manage all the affairs of the farm and business. They negotiated the sale of crops, managed the accounts, and directed the labor of the harvest. The image of a woman standing in a field, looking at the sky to judge the weather for the harvest, represents a shift in the social fabric. She was no longer just the keeper of the hearth. She was the keeper of the land. The psychological weight of this waiting was immense. Rumors flew faster than facts. A report of a battle might arrive weeks before the list of casualties. Every rider approaching the house, the sound of hooves on the dirt road, would cause a moment of suspended breath. Was it news? Was it a letter? Or was it just a traveler passing through? The silence of the farmhouse in the evening, with the empty chair at the table, was a palpable presence. When a letter did arrive, it was a physical treasure. Paper was expensive and scarce. Letters were often written in a tiny, cramped hand to maximize the space, the lines crossing over each other, a technique known as crosswriting. The ink, made from oak galls and iron, would fade over time to a sepia brown. The paper would be folded and sealed with wax. Envelopes were not yet in common use. To receive such a letter in the camp was a moment of profound emotion. A soldier would find a quiet corner, away from the noise of the mess, to break the seal. He would read the news of the harvest, the health of the children, the local gossip of the village. He would run his thumb over the signature, a tactile connection to the hand that wrote it. The scent of the paper might carry a trace of the home, the smell of dried lavender packed in a trunk, or the wood smoke of the family hearth. These letters were read and reread until the folds tore and the ink blurred. They were carried in the pocket of the hunting shirt, resting against the heart, a talisman of the life that waited for them. The families also worked to support the army directly. In the evenings, by the light of tallow candles or whale oil lamps, women and children would knit heavy wool stockings or sew shirts. They would roll bandages from old linens. These bundles of supplies were sent to the camps, a tangible proof of their devotion. The war was fought not just with muskets, but with knitting needles and spinning wheels. The spinning of wool, the rhythmic whir-whir of the wheel, was the soundtrack of the home front's resistance. For those living in the path of the armies, in New Jersey and New York, the war was not a distant rumor, but a terrifying reality. They lived with the fear of foraging parties stripping their barns, or of their homes being commandeered for officers' quarters. They hid their silver and their livestock in the woods. They lived in a state of suspended normalcy, trying to maintain the rhythms of agriculture while the storm of war swirled around them. The years passed, the sharp, vivid urgency of 1776 slowly softened into the broader, grinding narrative of a long war. The teenage soldiers grew into hardened veterans. They marched south, they marched north. They endured the heat of Monmouth and the victory of Yorktown, and then, finally, it was over. The muskets were stacked for the last time. The uniforms, now ragged and faded, were folded away or worn until they disintegrated. The men returned to the farms and the shops, to the silence of the fields and the rhythm of the seasons. As we move to the final reflection, we look far forward, past the end of the war, to the twilight of the generation that fought it. 50 years later, in the 1830s, the United States was a different country. The forests had been cleared for towns. Canals and early railroads were beginning to cut through the landscape. The revolution had passed from current events into history and then into myth. But the men were still there. They were old now, in their 70s and 80s. Their hair was white, their backs bent by decades of labor and the lingering ache of old campaigns. In 1832, Congress passed a pension act granting a stipend to the surviving veterans. To claim it, these old men had to go to the local courthouse and give a testimony of their service. These records, preserved in dusty archives, are the voices of the ghosts. They sat before young clerks and recounted the days of their youth. They remembered the mud, the hunger, the names of their captains. They remembered the crossing. One can picture such a scene. An old man, his hands gnarled and trembling, resting on a hickory cane. He sits in a sunlit room, the dust motes dancing in the air. He speaks slowly, his voice raspy with age. He tells of the cold that night on the river, a cold that he says he can still feel in his joints when the winter wind blows. He speaks of Washington, not as a marble statue, but as a tall man on a horse who looked tired and determined. He speaks of the friends who did not come home, their names spoken softly into the quiet room. In the 1860s, a photographer sought out the very last survivors of the war men who were over 100 years old. He took their pictures, creating the series known as the last men of the Revolution. In these grainy, black and white daguerreotypes, we see their faces. They look like ancient, weathered oaks. Their eyes, staring into the camera lens, have seen the birth of a nation. They wear old-fashioned clothes, waistcoats, and cravats, relics of a bygone era. They sit in rocking chairs on porches, the modern world rushing by them, secure in their own silent history. The animosity toward the British had long since faded, replaced by a sense of shared history. The reunions of the veterans were peaceful affairs. They would gather in town squares on the 4th of July, wearing faded ribbons on their lapels. They would shake hands, the grip weak but the bond strong. They would eat together, breaking bread as they had done over the campfires of their youth. They were living monuments, treated with a reverence that bemused them. To their grandchildren, they were the storytellers. On long winter evenings, by the warmth of the hearth, a child would ask, "Grandfather, were you there?" And the old man would nod, his eyes looking past the fire into the distance of memory. He would tell the story again, the edges smoothed by time, the terror replaced by a quiet pride. He would tell of the snow that turned red, of the river that choked with ice, and of the morning they surprised the world. As the 19th century marched on, these voices fell silent, one by one. The last veteran passed away, and the direct link to the event was severed. The story became ink on paper, monuments in stone, and legends in the national psyche. The physical reality, the smell of the gunpowder, the taste of the fire cake, the scratch of the wool evaporated, leaving only the spirit of the thing. And so, the story of the teenage revolutionary fades into the fabric of time. It settles into the archives, into the quiet rows of headstones in country churchyards, into the names of streets and towns. The urgency is gone, the cold is gone. What remains is the stillness of history. The history books close, the dates and names settle into the dust of the archives. What remains is not the noise of the cannon, but the quiet spirit of endurance. We have walked through their winter, shared their fire, and now we leave them to their rest in the peaceful distance of the past. The lesson is learned, the reflection is complete, and the mind is free to drift away. The battles are over. The smoke has cleared. The ink on the parchment is dry. We leave behind the generals and the soldiers. We leave behind the noise of history. Now we step into the quiet spaces between the dates and the names. We step into the world as it breathed and slept in the year 1776. This is a journey into stillness, a journey into the deep, slow rhythm of a younger world. Close your eyes, let your shoulders drop, let your breath become long and steady. There is nothing for you to do here. There is only the world to witness. We begin in the wild. We are far from the cities of brick and cobblestone. We are deep in the heart of the continent. This is the virgin forest. It is vast. It is ancient. It is a world of green shadows and soft earth. Here, the trees are not merely plants. They are titans. They are pillars that hold up the sky. Imagine you are standing at the base of a white pine. It is enormous. The trunk is so wide that 3 men linking hands could barely reach around it. It rises straight and true, a column of dark, rough bark that vanishes into the canopy high above. This tree was a sapling before the first ships crossed the ocean. It has stood here through storms and droughts, through silent winters and buzzing summers. It is a living monument to time itself. Around you, the forest floor is soft. It is a deep, plush carpet of pine needles. Layer upon layer has fallen over the centuries, creating a cushion that absorbs every sound. When you walk here, your footsteps make no noise. You move like a ghost. The silence is profound. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, living stillness. It is the silence of a cathedral. The air here is different. It is cool and rich. Take a breath. Smell the sharp, clean scent of pine resin. It is a smell that clears the mind. Underlying that is the scent of damp earth, of rich soil, of old wood slowly returning to the ground. It is the perfume of the earth itself. High above, the canopy is a ceiling of green. The leaves are so thick that the sun cannot push through fully. It filters down in thin, golden beams. These beams of light dance on the forest floor. They illuminate a patch of fern here, a mossy rock there. The light is soft. It is a perpetual twilight. Even at noon, the forest holds the secrets of the evening. In this year, the woods are home to giants that are now gone. The American chestnut trees stand in great groves. They are massive, spreading their branches wide, dropping their nuts to the floor to feed the bears and the deer. They are the kings of this wood. Their bark is gray and deeply furrowed. They feel permanent, unshakable. Listen, can you hear the wind? It starts high in the tops of the pines. It is a soft, rushing sound, like the ocean far away. It sways the giant trees gently. They creak, a slow wooden groan of timber rubbing against timber. It is a comforting sound. It speaks of strength. It speaks of endurance. A stream winds its way through the roots. The water is crystal clear. It is so clear it looks like liquid glass flowing over the smooth gray stones. It is cold. If you dipped your hand in, it would chill your fingers instantly. The sound of the water is a gentle melody. It babbles and whispers as it flows over the rocks. It is a continuous, unending song that has played here for 1,000 years. A deer steps into a pool of sunlight. It freezes. Its ears twitch. It is a creature of grace and caution. Its coat. It lowers its head to drink from the stream. The only sound is the soft lap of its tongue against the water. Then it lifts its head, blinks its large dark eyes, and melts back into the shadows. The moss here is everywhere. It covers the fallen logs in a velvet coat of emerald green. It climbs the north side of the trees. It softens the edges of the rocks. Reach out and touch it in your mind. It is cool and damp. It yields under your fingers like a sponge. It holds the moisture of the morning mist long into the day. This is a world without engines. There is no hum of machinery in the distance. There is no rumble of wheels. There is only the wind, the water, the occasional call of a bird. A mourning dove coos somewhere in the distance. A sad, hollow sound that echoes through the trees. Hoo, hoo. It is a lonely sound, but it is also peaceful. It reminds you that you are alone in this vastness. But you are not lonely. You are held by the forest. You are protected by the trees. The seasons turn slowly here. Imagine the autumn. The maples ignite into flame, red, gold, orange. They drop their leaves one by one, drifting down through the still air like slow rain. The forest floor becomes a mosaic of color. The air turns crisp. The smell of decaying leaves rises, sweet and musky. Or imagine the winter. The snow falls in heavy, wet flakes. It clings to the pine boughs, weighing them down. The forest becomes a sculpture of white and dark green. The silence deepens. The stream freezes at the edges, leaving only a thin ribbon of black water flowing in the center. But for now, it is the eternal summer of the past. The light is gold, the shadows are long. You are standing in a temple built by nature. The pillars are wood, the roof is leaves, the floor is the earth. You can rest here. You can lean your back against the rough bark of the giant pine. You can feel the solidity of it behind you. You can let the peace of the ancient woods seep into your bones, slow, quiet, still. We drift now. We leave the green cathedral of the forest. We float through the trees, moving towards a faint light in the distance. The air grows warmer. The smell of pine fades, replaced by the scent of wood smoke. We are approaching a shelter, a place of human comfort in the vast wilderness. We find ourselves outside a tavern. It is late at night. The windows are shuttered, but thin slivers of orange light escape through the cracks. We pass through the heavy oak door. The cold night air is left behind. We are enveloped in warmth. This is the keeping room. It is the heart of the tavern. The room is low and cozy. Heavy beams of hand-hewn oak run across the ceiling. They are dark with age and smoke. The floor is made of wide planks of pine, worn smooth by generations of boots. But tonight, there are no boots pacing the floor. The room is empty of people. It is time for sleep. The center of the room is the hearth. It is massive, a cavern of stone and brick that dominates the wall. The fire has burned down low. Earlier in the evening, it roared and crackled, feeding on great logs of hickory and maple. Now it is a bed of glowing coals. They pulse with a deep, intense red light. Every now and then, a small flame licks up, blue and orange, dancing on a piece of unburnt wood. Watch the embers. They are hypnotic. They shift and settle with soft, tinkling sounds. A log breaks apart, sending a shower of golden sparks drifting up the chimney. They look like fireflies vanishing into the dark. The heat radiating from the hearth is a physical weight. It presses against your skin, gentle and heavy. It warms you through your clothes. It chases away the chill of the forest. The light in the room is soft and shifting. Shadows dance on the plaster walls. They stretch and shrink as the fire breathes. In the corner, a tall case clock stands against the wall. It is a sentinel of time. Listen to it. Talk, talk, talk. The rhythm is slow and steady. It is the heartbeat of the house. It counts the seconds, but it does not rush them. In this room, time seems to slow down. There is no urgency. There is only the fire and the clock. Look at the tables. They are trestle tables, made of solid wood. They have been scrubbed clean. On one table, a pewter mug has been left behind. The metal is dull and gray, but it catches the light of the fire. A single highlight of orange reflects on its curved surface. It is a small star in the shadowy room. Above the hearth, herbs are drying. Bunches of sage, thyme, and lavender hang from the beams. The heat from the fire releases their oils. The air is filled with a subtle, earthy perfume. It mixes with the smell of the wood smoke and the faint, sweet scent of dried apples in a bowl. It is the smell of home. It is the smell of safety. In the corner, near the warmth of the stones, a dog is sleeping. It is a large, shaggy hound. It lies on its side, legs stretched out. Its chest rises and falls in a slow rhythm that matches the ticking of the clock. Occasionally, it twitches. Perhaps it is chasing a rabbit in its dreams. But here, in the waking world, it is perfectly safe. The fire warms its fur. The stone floor is solid beneath it. The windows are closed tight against the night. Heavy wooden shutters bar the cold. You can hear the wind outside, rattling the latch gently, but it cannot get in. You are enclosed. You are protected. The walls are thick. The door is barred. The fire is warm. Sit on one of the wooden settles by the fire. The high back wraps around you, shielding you from drafts. Lean back. Watch the red glow of the coals. Let your eyes go out of focus. The room is a capsule of golden light in a world of darkness. The shadows in the corners are soft and velvety. The silence is not empty here either. It is filled with the comfort of human presence, even in sleep. The wood settles in the grate, a soft pop, a sigh of ash. The heat makes you heavy. Your eyelids feel thick. The ticking of the clock becomes a lullaby. Talk, talk, talk. It measures out peace. It measures out rest. There is nowhere else you need to be. This tavern, this hearth, has stood here for years. It will stand here for years to come. It is a rock in the river of time, and for tonight it is your sanctuary. Let the warmth sink into you. Let the smell of the herbs relax your mind. Let the rhythm of the clock slow your heart. You are safe in the keeping room. You are warm by the fire. But our journey continues. We leave the warmth of the tavern, drifting like smoke through the chimney. We float out into the cool night air. We move down the quiet village lane. The houses are dark. The world is asleep. We are heading towards a small building at the edge of the village. We can smell it before we see it. The scent of raw wood and oil. It is the wheelwright's shop. We slip inside. The air here is cool and still. It smells of sawdust and sharp iron. It smells of linseed oil and beeswax. This is a place of work, but now it is at rest. The silence here is different. It is the silence of potential. It is the silence of tools waiting for the master's hand. Moonlight streams in through the windows. It cuts across the dusty air in pale blue shafts. Millions of tiny dust motes dance in the light. They swirl and float, suspended in the air. They are like tiny stars in a wooden galaxy. Look at the workbench. It is a massive slab of elm, inches thick. The surface is scarred and pitted from years of work. It is smooth to the touch, polished by the friction of wood and skin. Run your hand along the edge. It feels cool and solid. On the wall, the tools hang in their places. They are shadows against the wood, saws with jagged teeth, chisels with wooden handles worn smooth by grip, planes made of heavy iron and polished beech. They hang motionless. During the day, they screech and bite into the wood. They make noise, they make dust, but tonight they are silent. They are sleeping metal. The floor is covered in shavings, long, curly ribbons of white oak and ash. They look like waves on a frozen sea. They crunch softly if you were to step on them, but we are floating. We drift over them. They release the scent of fresh sap. It is a clean, sharp smell, the smell of the forest brought indoors. Against the wall leans a wheel. It is unfinished. The hub is turned from tough elm, designed to not crack. The spokes are hickory, strong and flexible. The rim is ash. It is a masterpiece of joinery. The pieces fit together with absolute precision. There are no gaps. There is no glue, just wood gripping wood. It is waiting for the iron tire to be shrunk onto it. But that is work for tomorrow. Tonight, it rests. The moonlight highlights the grain of the wood. You can see the lines of the oak, the swirl of the knots. It is a map of the tree's life. Every ring is a year. Every curve is a branch. The wood remembers the forest. Even here, shaped and smoothed, it holds the memory of the wind and the rain. There is a calmness here. It is the calmness of a job well done. The orderliness of the shop brings peace to the mind. Everything has a place. Everything is ready. There is no chaos here, just the quiet waiting of the wood. A small mouse scurries across the floor. It stops to inspect a shaving. Its whiskers twitch. It is a tiny movement in the stillness. It scuttles away into the shadows behind a stack of lumber. The silence returns. The smell of the linseed oil is rich and nutty. It protects the wood. It feeds it. It is a smell of preservation. This shop is a place where things are made to last. In a world of fleeting moments, this place builds things that endure. The wheels made here will roll for miles. They will carry families. They will carry burdens. They will travel roads not yet built. But now, the wheel stands still. The saw hangs straight. The dust motes drift. It honors the materials of the earth. It honors the skill of the hand. Stand in the moonlight. Breathe in the scent of the cedar shavings. Feel the stillness of the heavy tools. This is a quietude of purpose, a rest earned by labor. We drift out of the window, carried on a moonbeam. We leave the village behind. We float over the fields, over the sleeping fences. We move towards the lowest point in the valley. We are drawn to the water. We arrive at the banks of the Delaware River. It is night. The river is wide here. It is a vast, moving sheet of darkness. It stretches from bank to bank, powerful and silent. This is not the babbling brook of the forest. This is a giant. This is a force of nature. Stand on the muddy bank. The willows trail their long branches in the water. They look like women with long hair bending to drink. The reeds rustle dryly in the gentle breeze. She, they whisper secrets to the water. The surface of the river is smooth. It looks like black glass, but if you look closely, you can see the current. It creates swirls and eddies, small whirlpools that form and vanish in an instant. The water is moving. It is always moving. It flows south, towards the bay, towards the great ocean. It has flowed this way for eons. It will flow this way long after we are gone. Look up. The sky is a dome of velvet black, scattered with diamonds. The stars are brilliant. There are no city lights to dim them. They burn with a cold, hard fire. The Milky Way is a smear of white dust across the heavens. Now look down. The river catches the stars. They are reflected in the black water. They dance and tremble with the current. As above, so below. You are standing between two skies, one of air and one of water. A mist is rising from the river. It is a steam fog, born of the difference between the warm water and the cold air. It curls up like smoke. It hovers over the surface in ghostly wisps. It softens the far bank. The trees on the other side are just dark shapes, blurry and indistinct. The world feels small, limited to what you can see in the starlight. Listen to the water. It makes a soft lapping sound against the mud. Lap, lap, lap. It is a rhythmic, soothing sound. It is the breath of the river. Occasionally, a fish jumps. A splash breaks the silence. Ripples spread out in perfect circles, disturbing the reflection of the stars. Then the water smooths out again. The mirror is restored. A piece of driftwood floats by. It is a gray, twisted branch. It moves swiftly with the current. It is on a journey. It surrenders to the flow. It does not fight. It simply goes where the river takes it. Imagine you are that wood. You are weightless, you are supported, you are drifting. There is no effort. There is only the flow. The air here is damp and cool. It smells of wet mud and green algae. It smells of fish and cold stone. It is a primal smell. This river is a vein of the continent. It carries the lifeblood of the land. In 1776, there are no bridges here, no steel spans crossing the water. The river is a barrier and a road. It is wild. It belongs to itself. The silence is heavy here. It is the silence of deep water. It swallows sound, a heron. It stands on one leg, perfectly still. Its silhouette is sharp against the mist. It waits. It watches. It is part of the river. It is part of the night. The flow is endless. It is hypnotic to watch. The water moves past you, gallon after gallon, ton after ton. It never stops. It never tires. It reminds you that things pass. Worries pass. Days pass. The river takes them all away. It carries them down to the sea, where they are washed clean. Stand by the river. Let the sound of the lapping water fill your ears. Let the sight of the drifting mist calm your mind. You are standing on the edge of eternity. The water flows on and on and on. We begin to drift again. We follow the river. We float with the current. The night is long, but it is not forever. The earth is turning, slowly, inexorably. We are moving towards the light. We find ourselves now on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The river is a silver ribbon far below. The village is a cluster of dark shapes. The forest is a sea of black. We are waiting for the dawn. This is the blue hour, the time before the sun. The sky is changing. It is no longer black. It is a deep, rich indigo. The stars are fading, one by one. They are winking out, retiring for the day. The air is at its coldest. It is crisp and biting. It wakes the skin. Watch the eastern horizon. A faint line of pale violet appears. It grows slowly. It pushes the blue upward. The violet turns to pink, a soft, dusty rose color that spreads across the bottom of the sky. The silhouette of the mountains becomes sharp and clear. They are purple cutouts against the brightening sky. Listen, the silence of the night is breaking. It starts with a single note, a robin. It sings a cheerful, bubbling song. Then a sparrow joins in. Then a thrush. The birdsong swells. It is the chorus of the morning. It is a song of welcome. They are singing the sun up. The mist in the valley begins to lift. It rises from the river and the fields. It glows white in the growing light. It looks like a soft blanket being pulled back from the sleeping earth. The colors shift again. The pink turns to gold, a burning, radiant gold that promises warmth. The clouds catch the fire. Their undersides turn crimson and orange. The sky is a painting that changes every second. It is a masterpiece created just for this moment. Look at the grass at your feet. It is covered in dew. Millions of tiny droplets cling to the blades. They are the tears of the morning. As the light grows, they begin to sparkle. They look like crushed diamonds scattered on the hill. A spider web stretches between two bushes. It is laden with dew. It looks like a necklace of pearls. It is fragile and perfect. Far below, a rooster crows. It is a faint, distant sound. The farms are waking up. But up here, on the ridge, there is only peace. The peace of a new beginning. The slate of the night has been wiped clean. The day is new. It has no mistakes in it yet. It is pure potential. The light hits the tops of the tallest trees first. The pines we saw earlier, the giants, catch the sun. Their dark green needles turn bright emerald. They are crowned with light. The light creeps down the valley walls. It touches the roof of the tavern. It touches the river. Then the sun itself breaks the horizon, a sliver of blinding white fire. It grows into a disk. The first ray of direct sunlight hits your face. It is warm. You can feel the heat of it instantly. It chases away the chill of the dawn. It is the return of life. It is the return of hope. The world is revealed. The colors are true again. The green of the grass, the blue of the river, the brown of the earth. The night is gone. The shadows have fled. You are standing in the light. The air is clear. It is so clean it feels like drinking cold water. The visibility is endless. You can see for miles. You can see the rolling hills, the dense forests, the winding river. It is a vast, beautiful land. It is a land at peace. The birds are loud now. The day has begun. But you are still resting. You have journeyed through the night. You have walked the forest floor. You have sat by the fire. You have watched the river. And now you have seen the sun return. The cycle is complete. The wheel has turned. The light of the new day washes over the valley, warm and golden. The echoes of the past have faded, leaving only the stillness of the present moment. Thank you for journeying with me tonight, for walking the roads of history and resting by its fires. You are safe, you are at peace, and the world is quiet. Until we meet again in the next story, sleep well.